Welcome everyone! After my little detour looking at some Alexei Shirov games, I thought it was time to include some more recent games as well. I've decided to cover another game by the always entertaining Daniil Dubov. This was a very sharp game in the Semi-Slav with unsafe kings and nice tactics. He faced Anish Giri and it was played in the Moscow Grand Prix in 2019. Let's get it started. Dubov had white and opened with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight to f3, and after d5 we could see a queen's gambit declined, but after bishop g5 and d takes c4 we'll actually transpose to a variation of the Semi-Slav. Now this capture does allow white to take the center, and Dubov did claim the center with e4, b5 hanging on to the pawn, and here Dubov played a4 to undermine the protection of the c-pawn. The pin of the knight is not dangerous, by the way. If white tries e5, then black can counterattack the bishop with h6, and now the bishop either has to take, or after bishop to h4, the bishop will be attacked as well after g5, and black has no problems at all. Instead, Dubov went a4. Giri supported the pawn with c6, then knight to c3, adding another attacker to the b-pawn, but black just pushed with b4, kicking the knight, but also weakening the c4 pawn. Knight to b1, at least by retreating to b1 instead of e2, the bishop is still attacking the c-pawn, therefore bishop a6 defending. And here Dubov did decide to make use of the pin, which will also damage black's pawn structure. Black counterattacked the bishop with h6, then bishop takes, and after pawn takes f6, you can see indeed black's pawn structure isn't too good anymore. White recaptured on f6, then c5, fighting back in the center and hoping to put the knight on c6. Another option was developing the knight to d7, and after knight from b to d2, queen takes pawn, although after bishop takes c4, bishop b7, and queen to e2, white does have the option to trade the bishops with bishop to a6. Anyway, Giri chose c5, then Dubov redeployed the knight to d2, and now black went c3. I guess it would have been consistent to go knight to c6, and after bishop takes, knight takes, go queen takes pawn, but maybe it's still unpleasant for black after d takes c5, because white may get a pawn on d6 after knight d6 check. Instead he went c3, they traded pawns, then the knight hopped to e4, which is a very good central square for the knight, and it also cannot be kicked away by pawns anymore. Giri captured on d4. Another interesting option was c4, making the position a bit more closed, which would benefit black because he lacks in development. And here it could continue with bishop to e2, knight to d7, and then black can just take on f6, go bishop g7 and castle. Instead, black captured on d4. But now Dubov had this clever move, bishop b5 check, which is pretty annoying for black because after black takes, the pawn on b5 makes developing even harder for black. Black has to take though, and after a b5, you can see the pawn already takes two of the knight squares away, and on top of that it also pins the black a-pawn. And here Giri did make a mistake, but he wasn't punished for it. He went for the normal looking queen to d5, simply threatening the b-pawn. It would have been better to go d3, and after knight takes c3, go knight to d7, and after castles, white can indeed win the pawn back after knight to e5, but black will win the f6 pawn. What he did in the game gave Dubov something really strong. First Dubov played queen takes d4, and after queen takes pawn, Dubov missed his chance and just captured on c3. He could have gone knight to e5 here, which wouldn't be possible after black pushed his pawn to d3, since the queen wouldn't be covering the e4 square. Now this looks quite threatening already, and it could continue with knight to d7, and then this very cool move, rook to a5, You can see that the black queen is overworked. It has to keep covering the knight. Black can throw in these checks. Now there's no more checks and there's a mate threat on d7, therefore knight takes knight. But after queen takes, black is losing because white will go queen to c7 and then threaten with rook takes pawn and knight to d6 check. And if the rook covers c7, then just rook takes pawn and knight to d6 check is the threat and black's just falling apart. But Dubov didn't play that, he just took the pawn and then bishop b4 was played, pinning the knight and black's planning knight to c6 with a tempo on the queen. However, Dubov played a really daring move here. He just castled. Now the knight isn't pinned anymore, but more importantly, this makes sure white keeps the initiative, because as you'll notice, there's now a mate threat on d8. Maybe the safest for black is to just trade queens here. Instead, Giri went queen to a5, again putting pressure on the knight, but the knight just hopped into action with knight to b5. Of course, black cannot take the knight because of the mate on d8, therefore knight to a6. Don't blunder and go castles, by the way, because it's mate in 2 after queen g4, queen g7 checkmate, therefore knight to a6. But now the queen came in, queen d7 check, king to f8, and then king to b1, which maybe seems a bit odd, but the king is safer on the light squares, given black has a dark square bishop, and there are no immediate checks anyway. And at this point, unfortunately for Giri, he did make a critical mistake. He could have gone bishop to c5, planning queen b4 check, but instead he went bishop to a3, which has the same idea, but here's the problem: rook to d3. On a3, the bishop is immediately threatened by the knight and the rook will also provide cover for the king when the king's running to the king side. Queen b4 check came next, but the king wants to go anyway. King to c2, queen a4 check, king to d2, then bishop b4 check. Now at least the bishop is safe again, but in the meantime the white king is running to safety already, and black gained nothing the last few moves. King to e2 was next. King g8, preventing any back rank checkmates. But then knight to e5, threatening with mate on f7. Black gave a check on c2. King to f3. Rook f8, covering against the mate. Rook from h to d1. And then h5 was played, which is a great move. It plants rook to h6, attacking the f6 pawn, but it also stops white from using the g4 square. Here the queen just centralized. There's nothing left to do on d7 anymore since f7 is defended. Then rook h7, giving the king a square. Queen f4, creeping over to the enemy king and keeping an eye on g5 and h6. Bishop c5, attacking the f2 pawn. Knight d4, blocking out the bishop. Queen a2, planning a check on d5, but it's not going to help black anymore. Rook from 1 to d2 was played. Then the check. King to e2. The king is in no danger at all. It did continue for a bit. Bishop b4 was played. But Dubov had a nice response. Knight from d to c6. And now the bishop cannot take the rook, otherwise knight e7 would fork king and queen. That's why queen to c5. But knight e7 check anyway. But after king to h8 was played, Giri decided to resign anyway. Now why did he resign? Because white would play knight takes f7 check here. If rook from f takes f7, then it's game over after rook d8 and rook takes rook checkmate. And if the other rook takes, then there is queen check, rook h7 and queen takes rook checkmate. Again, just a very fine game by Daniil Dubov. Black was struggling with his king position for the entire game, which also prevented him from using his rooks properly. Also, Dubov clearly had activity as his first priority, even castling his king away from the pawn cover and closer to the black queen. And by playing this way, he did get rewarded in the end. Anyway, I'll cover more great games like this very soon. In the meantime, you may want to check out more games in the playlist. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching, chess student, and take care.